Good evening to you all, and welcome to the beginning of this year's Durham Castle lecture series. We had a fantastic year last year, and all last year's lectures are unlike as typical in Durham University. All Castle lectures are all filmed online and available on our website, as will this lecture be in a few days' time. I'm delighted to see you all here, and I'm particularly pleased to welcome Shereen El Feki, who is speaking on the topic here so boldly projected, Sex and the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World. The event this evening is a joint enterprise, actually, between the Durham Castle Lecture Series and the Research Cluster, Islam, Law and Modernity, and we thank you all as a cluster, I should say, for helping to make this evening possible. This topic, sex and the citadel, sex and love, at once is, of course, much more than its surface appearance. It's sex, gender, generations, religion, tradition, politics, and economics. In short, sex and love touches on almost everything. Shireen is the author of this book, published this year by Random House. I don't know whether we've got copies here to show everybody. I don't know whether we have, but this is the cover, I take it. Yeah, very nice. She didn't begin, however, writing to this cluster of interest. Much to my surprise, Shireen's research started in medicine, and she took a doctorate in immunology from Cambridge University. From there on, she developed a career as a award-winning healthcare correspondent, 7 years with The Economist, did you say 3 years with Al Jazeera English. She's the former vice chair of the UN Commission on HIV and Law, as well as a TED Global Fellow. She contributes to a large number of publications on a regular basis. I'll just mention the Huffington Post and the Independent. She has intriguing roots in Egypt and Wales. She grew up in Canada and now divides her time between London and Cairo. So please join with me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Well, I have to say what a delight it is to be here. I'm honored to be invited to participate in this lecture series. I have to say that since publishing the book, I have traveled very widely discussing these issues. I've been in some unusual venues. In Los Angeles, for example, I gave a talk at the Silent Movie Theater, and I was paired with a stand-up comedian. So that's comedy, silence, sex in a nutshell, basically. In New York, I was on stage at the Museum of Sex with a former sex worker turned novelist. So I have to say this is one of the most distinguished venues and audiences I've had the pleasure to address. So again, many thanks. I want to begin with a story, and this is one of the experiences I had in Morocco, in Casablanca, not so long ago. I met with a young unmarried mother called Faiza, and Faiza showed me photos of her infant son, and she told me the story of his conception, her pregnancy, and the delivery. It was a truly remarkable tale, but Faiza saved the best for last. She said to me, Dr. Shireen, I am a virgin. I have 2 medical certificates to prove my virginity. So here we have it. Welcome to the modern Middle East, where 2 millennia after the coming of Christ, virgin births are still a fact of life. Now, I have to say that Faiza's story is one of hundreds I've heard over the past 5 years, traveling across the Arab region, talking to people about sex, what they do, what they don't, what they think, and why. Now, I know, depending on your perspective, this might sound like a dream job or possibly a slightly dubious occupation. But for me, it was something else altogether. So as David mentioned, I am half Egyptian, I am Muslim, but I grew up in Canada very far from my Arab roots. And I never thought much about my Arab heritage until September 11th. And the events of that day, that tragic day, really stimulated me to want to know more about where I came from. The fact that I chose sex as my lens, I know, is a little unusual, But as David mentioned, it stems from my professional background. I was an immunologist, and when I went to work at The Economist, part of my job was reporting on the global HIV/AIDS epidemic. Now, we have HIV in the Arab region. In fact, we're on one of only 2 parts of the world where HIV is still on the rise. And if you want to tackle HIV in the Arab region, you have to look at sex, because it's the main route of transmission, and it lies at the heart of the difficulties we face in rising to the occasion, rising to the challenge of HIV. And so I started to ask people about sex in that context of HIV. I had on my white coat of public health, and it got me in the door to talk to people about sex. But once I got in the door, I took off my white coat, and then I started talking about sexuality, which is more than just attitudes and behaviors. It's values, it's beliefs, it's fears, it's desires. And as David mentioned, it tells you so much about a society, because what happens in our intimate lives is affected by what happens on a bigger stage, in politics, in economics, in history, in tradition, in gender, in generations. And frankly, at the end of the day, if you really want to know a people, you start by looking inside the bedroom. Now, a quick question for those of you here. How many of you have traveled to the Middle East, are from the Middle East, have connections to the Middle East? Excellent, excellent, a substantial number. So for those of you who are not so familiar with the region, let me define the terms. We're talking about a region which is 22 countries, 370 million people. The area I looked at extended from Morocco in the west to Iraq in the east, and from Sudan in the south to the borders of Turkey in the north. We're talking about a region which is vast and it is varied, and there are huge differences between countries of wealth, of religious diversity, of ethnic diversity, and increasingly political diversity, as countries in the region take different paths, different trajectories through the upheaval, the political upheaval that is now sweeping the region. And it's not just differences between countries, it's also differences within countries. In Egypt, for example, which is the focus of my book, you can find tremendous differences depending upon where you live, how educated you are, how much money you have. So the bottom line is that it's hard to generalize about the Arab world. However, there are commonalities. And one of these common features is the fact that the only socially accepted context for sex is marriage. And we're not talking about any old marriage, we're talking about marriage that is religiously approved, that is approved by your family, and that is registered by the state. Marriage is your ticket to adulthood in most communities across the Arab region. If you don't get married, it's very hard to move out of your parents' place, particularly if you're a woman. You're not supposed to be having sex, and you're definitely not supposed to be having children. So sex within marriage is like a social citadel. It's the citadel that gives my book its title. It's an impregnable fortress that resists any alternative, any change. And around this citadel is a vast field of taboo against premarital sex, homosexuality, abortion, condoms, masturbation, you name it. Now, Faiza, whom I mentioned earlier, she's living proof of this. Her virginity statement was not a piece of wishful thinking. Now, although the major religions of the Arab region extol the value of chastity before marriage, we're talking about patriarchal societies in the Arab region, and boys will be boys. Men have sex before marriage, and people more or less turn a blind eye. This is not true for women, who are expected to be virgins on their wedding night, and by that we mean turn up with your hymen intact. They have a saying in Egypt, the honor of a girl is like a match, it only lights once. And they're referring to her virginity. And this virginity is not an individual concern. Your hymen is a collective matter. It's your family's concern. It's about your family's honor, your family's reputation, and in particular, the honor and reputation of the men of the family. And as a consequence of this collective concern, women will go to these extraordinary lengths to either protect or to demonstrate or to repair their hymens. And these measures include female genital mutilation, which is thought to keep women on the straight and narrow by clipping the clitoris and therefore reducing their sexual desire. There is virginity testing, which happens in many communities. And of course, there's also hymen repair surgery. Now, Faiza chose a different route. She had non-vaginal sex. She had superficial sexual relations. But Faiza became pregnant all the same, only she didn't realize it because there is so little sexual education in schools and there's so little communication in families these days around sex. When Faiza's condition became too obvious to hide, it was her mother who helped her flee in the night from her family because of the fear of what her father and her brothers might do. And that fear was of an honor killing. And this is a shadowy reality for untold numbers of women across the Arab region. So when Faiza eventually fetched up at a hospital in Casablanca where she hoped to find some assistance, the man who offered to help her instead tried to rape her. And when she told me this story, she said, in a remarkably calm voice, given all that she had been through, she said that I screamed at him, "Never touch me, because I am a virgin." And she said that when I delivered my son, it was that man's face that was the only thing I could see. It was a fear that I can never forget. I have to say that Faiza is not alone. In researching my book, I found plenty of trouble in sexual life in and out of the Citadel. And let me give you a few examples. So there are legions of young men across the Arab region who can't afford to get married because we're looking at economies in the Arab region that have opened themselves up to the full force of global capitalism, and marriage has become a celebration of conspicuous consumption. It's really expensive. Men are expected to bear the burden of costs of marriage from the wedding onwards, but they can't get jobs. Remember, the unemployment, youth unemployment in particular, is one of the major drivers of the uprisings we've seen in the Arab Spring. And as a consequence of this, the age of marriage is rising in much of the Arab region. In Tunisia, for example, it now stands at late 20s for young women and early 30s for young men. Now, the Prophet Muhammad extolled Muslims to remain chaste before marriage, and in order to do so, to fast. But the Prophet Muhammad did not mean that we as Muslims were supposed to fast until our 30s. So what are all these young people who can't afford marriage, what are they going to do? On the other side, there are career women who are dynamic and educated and intelligent and attractive, but they can't find husbands. It's not because they don't want to get married. Most people want to be inside the Citadel. It's that they can't find husbands because they don't conform to gender expectations. Now, there are a number of reasons why there are so many single women in many parts of the Arab region, but it was really summed up for me very nicely by a young female doctor in Tunisia who said to me, the women are becoming more and more open, but the man, he is still at the prehistoric stage. We also have men and women across the Arab region who cross the heterosexual line. These are individuals who have sex with their own sex or who have a different gender identity. These individuals are on the receiving end of laws which criminalize their behaviors, but very often even their appearance. And they face a daily struggle with social stigma, with family despair, and with religious fire and brimstone. And I have to say, it's not all that rosy in the marital bed either. Time and again in my research, I heard from couples who were desperate for a better sexual life, but they really were at a loss of actually how to improve relations between husbands and wives. And in particular, wives who were afraid of being seen as bad women if they showed some spark in the bedroom, although their husbands were saying that they were looking for more excitement there. And this is really summed up by my Egyptian grandmother and one of her pithy proverbs, which runs throughout Sex and the Citadel. And my grandmother used to say, "A woman who trusts a man is like a woman who stores water in a sieve." And of course, there are also people who are in marriages, but their marriages are actually essentially an Islamic cover for prostitution. These are women who are often sold into temporary marriages by their families, often to Arab sex tourists, but essentially their unions are just a cover for what is a booming sex trade across the Arab region. Now, I have to say, it's not as if the Arab world has a monopoly on sexual problems. And one of the more interesting aspects of the response to Sex in the Citadel has been the messages I've received from readers around the world, particularly across Asia and Latin America. And it becomes very clear from them that the issues that I discuss in the context of the Middle East and North Africa are not unique. They too recognize these dilemmas, particularly as they relate to the regulation of women's sexuality. Now, we don't really have a Kinsey report for the Arab world. We don't have any robust empirical research yet to tell us what's happening inside bedrooms. And even when this sort of research is done, and you can get permission to do it, more often than not, the results end up in a locked drawer. However, from the evidence that we do have, it's pretty clear that something is not going well in the Arab region when it comes to sexual life. We have double standards for men and women. We have sex as a source of shame, and we see it used as a tool of control and suppression, whether it's the rapes in the Libyan and Syrian civil wars, or indeed the routine use of rape as a form of torture in prisons in many countries in the Arab region. And of course, we have the issue of family control, limiting individual choices when it comes to sexual life. And the biggest issue we have, the dilemma we have, is a huge gap between appearance and reality, what people are doing and what they're willing to admit to, and a general reluctance to go beyond private whispers to a sustained public discussion in media, in schools, in government, to really discuss what are badly needed reforms. Again, it was one doctor in Egypt who summed up the situation for me perfectly. He said to me, "You know, here sex is the opposite of sport. Football, everyone talks about it, but hardly anyone plays it. But sex, everybody's doing it, but nobody wants to talk about it." Now, I have to say, this was not always the case. If we go back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad, there is a rich tradition in Islam of talking frankly about sex. Not just the problems, but also the pleasures of sex, and not just for men, but also for women. And for over a millennium from the time of the Prophet Muhammad, we had this steady stream of Arabic erotica, and much of it was written by religious scholars who saw no incompatibility between talking about the needs of the flesh and the needs of the faith. I want to give you one example, and it's called the Encyclopedia of Pleasure, and it comes from the late 10th, early 11th century Baghdad. The encyclopedia covers sex from aphrodisiacs to zoophilia and everything in between. I am telling you, there is nothing in The Joy of Sex or in Cosmopolitan or indeed YouPorn that the Encyclopedia of Pleasure did not cover over 1,000 years ago. Its message is very clear. Sex is God's gift to mankind, and we are meant to enjoy it. And the book is full of all these handy hints of how to make the most of it. You know, the text is, it's informative, it's arousing, and it's very often highly amusing. And I have to say that I attracted lots of dirty looks from readers in a London library as I squirmed and guffawed my way through passages like the one I'm about to read you. So this is from the Encyclopedia of Pleasure. And it's about a woman who lived in Medina. She's called Hubba al-Madaniyya. And remember, this is a book from the 10th and 11th century. Hubba al-Madaniyya, for instance, said that one day she went out of the bath accompanied by a boy who had a puppy. It so happened that the puppy, seeing her vulva and vaginal lips, went between her legs and began to lick her organ. She lowered her body to give the animal a better chance of performing its job. However, when she had reached an orgasm, she fell down heavily upon it and could not raise herself until the helpless animal had died from heavy pressure. My apologies to animal lovers in the audience. One measure of how open Arab culture used to be about sex is that we used to have whole dictionaries of sex. And indeed, there's one medieval book that lists over 1,000 verbs for to have sex. And this piece of calligraphy you see on the screen, it was done by a marvelous artist in Dubai called Wissam Shaukat. And this piece of calligraphy is made up of some of these lost words for sex. And these are words that Arabic speakers no longer understand today. And in fact, many people living in the Arab region, if they know another language, feel much more comfortable talking about sex in English or French or even in Hebrew, if they're Palestinians living in Israel, than they do about speaking about sex in their mother tongue. And these great books of Arabic erotica are hard to find in many Arab capitals. In fact, they're much more accessible in English. And I have to say one of the reasons for this is the work of scholars like Durham University's very own Professor Daniel Newman, who has been translating some of these great works of Arabic erotica into English. Again, available in foreign languages, very hard to find in Arabic. And in fact, it's not just the history. If we look today, if you want to get free and frank and informed advice about sex in Arabic, it's really hard to find, particularly if you're a woman. And what's interesting is that the sexual landscape in Egypt and in most of the Arab region looks a lot like Europe and America on the brink of the sexual revolution. But of course, while the West has opened up over past decades on sex, it appears that Arab societies have been moving in the opposite direction. In Egypt and in many of its neighbors, this closing down around sex is part of a broader process of closing down in political, economic, social, and cultural thought. And it's part of a really complex historical process, a process which takes in decades of colonial occupation and decades of military dictatorship. And it's a process of closing down which has really gained ground since the late 1970s with the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. Just say no is how conservatives around the world respond to any challenge to the sexual status quo. And in the Arab region, they brand any attempts to question taboos around sex as a Western conspiracy to undermine so-called traditional Arab and Islamic values. But in fact, what's at stake here is actually one of conservatives' most powerful tools of control, and that's sex wrapped up in religion. But our history shows us that even as recently as our fathers' and grandfathers' days, there was a much more open approach to sex, a greater tolerance, a greater pragmatism, and a greater willingness to consider other interpretations. Whether it's a question of abortion or condoms, or even the incendiary topic of homosexuality, it is not black and white in Islam as conservatives would have us believe. On these, as in so many issues in life in Islam, there are at least 50 shades of gray. In researching sex in the Citadel, I've met people across the region who are exploring that full spectrum of interpretation. For example, sexologists who are trying to help couples find happiness in their sexual lives. I met innovators who are managing to get sexuality education into schools, even in highly conservative communities, and this is a hugely difficult and controversial topic. I met groups of men and women who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, and transgendered, and they're reaching out to their peers across the region with online initiatives and also real-life support groups. There are men and women who are now starting to speak out about sexual violence, not just in the streets, but in the home as well. I met groups who are helping sex workers to protect themselves against HIV/AIDS and other occupational hazards. And also NGOs that are trying to find a place for people like FISA, unwed mothers, help them to get a job, reconcile with their families, and critically, how to keep their kids and how to find a place in society. Let me be quite clear, we are not talking about a sexual revolution in the Arab region. We're talking about a sexual evolution. We're learning from other parts of the world. We're adapting these lessons to local conditions. We are forging our own path. We're not following blindly in one blazed by another. And as one gay man in Cairo told me, and I asked him whether he wanted to see a gay rights movement as existed in the West? Did he think that this was the way forward? And this is a man who was on the sharp end of daily discrimination and truly horrifying police abuse. And he said to me, in the new order that is emerging in Egypt, he said, "I want my rights, but only within the framework of an Egyptian society. If I go for this gay pride, what am I really asking for? Go and kiss a man in the street? No, this is an Islamic country. I want respect. That's all that I want. Not because I am gay, but because I am a human being." Now that respect in a sexual context includes the right to control our own bodies, and it's the right to access the information and services we need to lead safe and satisfying sexual lives. It's the right to express our ideas about sex, to choose our partners, to choose to marry or not, to decide to be sexually active or not, to have children or not, and when we want to have them. And all this without violence or force or discrimination. And I have to say that's an incredibly tall order anywhere in the world. And we are very far from that in the Arab region. And so much needs to change. We're talking about reform of the law, of education, of the economy. The list goes on, and it is the work of a generation, at least. But that journey begins with, frankly, the journey that I have made, asking hard questions about received wisdoms. Now, there are 3 red lines in the Arab world. These are topics you're not supposed to challenge in word or deed. The first of these is politics, and that line has been well and truly crossed since 2011. The second red line is religion, and certainly with the rise and fall of groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, people are starting to ask very hard questions about, for example, the role of Islam in public life. Well, that third red line, it's sex. And Sex in the Citadel, my book, is a tiny contribution to what I hope is a bigger project of empowering people to ask hard questions about the way things are in sexual life. Now, I know that to talk about sex, to challenge the taboos, to seek alternatives, it might seem like something of a luxury at a time of turmoil across the Arab region. But frankly, the personal and the political are entwined. If we don't manage to anchor freedom and justice and dignity and equality and privacy and autonomy in our private lives, in our personal lives, in our sexual lives, we are going to find it very hard to achieve that in public life. At the end of the day, sex is not just a mirror of the conditions which have led to the uprising across the Arab region, but sex is also a measure of the hard-won reforms that millions are hoping to see in the decades to come. Thank you.